Good afternoon. Uh, it's a great pleasure to be at the Indian Society of Agriculture Marketing Conference. Greetings from Cornell University in New York. Professor Mahendra Dev, thank you for inviting me to give the Professor Radhakrishna Memorial Lecture. I'm a great admirer of Professor Radhakrishna's work, especially his work on agriculture development economics in India and his role as an institution builder, his contributions to building up CES in Hyderabad, and also his leadership of the Indian Society of Agriculture Marketing, which he was president for 2 decades, from 2002 to 2022. I was conference president for the ISAM in 2004 when the meeting was held in Shimla, and I got to meet and get to know Professor Radhakrishna at that time. One of the areas of particular focus for Professor Radhakrishna has been on inclusive growth, bringing people left behind into the growth process, particularly the rural community of India, and looking at how do you bring change, positive change to rural India. And in this context, my topic today is appropriate. What I would like to focus on is how do you connect small farm agriculture to the growing urban demand for food, growing urban demand for diversity of food. And so how do we commercialize small farm agriculture? And how do you create scale? How do you create scale through cooperatives, through farmer-producer organizations, etc.? So that's the topic that I'd like to spend my time talking about today. So there's a lot of discussion about farmer aggregation models, but much of those discussions start from the supply side. How do you aggregate? But very few discussions start from the demand side, which is why do you need to aggregate? And the why is related to meeting demand for food, meeting urban demand for food, and connecting into urban food value chains and connecting into urban supermarket value chains. I think this is an important way to understand the reasons why you would need to aggregate small farms and the reasons why some of them are successful and others are not. So as we know, diet transition has been happening rapidly across the country, and that tends to be the big driver of agriculture commercialization and small farm aggregation in India. Let's just take a minute and look at the data on what's happening on diet transformation. Those of you who are economists in the room will recognize Engel's law. Engel's law says that as incomes rise, the share of income spent on food declines. This doesn't mean that the actual amount spent on food declines, but the share of total expenditure on food declines as overall expenditures increase and as overall incomes increase. And you see from the NSS data over the decades that the Engel's curve is very much a phenomenon in India, as it is in any other part of the developing world and the developed world. So as incomes rise, India is going through the same transition that's consistent with Engel's law. But the other side of the story is that as incomes rise, we also see Bennett's law coming in. Bennett's law says that as incomes rise, the share of expenditure on primary staple cereals begins to decline, and the consumption of more nutritious food, a diverse diet, etc., increases. Now, in the case of India, again, using the NSS data, we can show very clearly that the share of expenditures on primary staples has declined quite rapidly, both in urban areas as well as in rural areas. And diversity is increasing, especially consumption of fruit, vegetables, dairy products, livestock products, etc. However, the extent to which diversity is increasing for the more nutritious commodities has been hampered by the rapid growth in processed food consumption. Processed food consumption has doubled and tripled over the last few decades. And that's true both in urban areas as well as in rural areas. Part of it is convenience, but part of it is also related to the fact that fresh food, more nutritious food, tend to have higher prices, and the relative price tends to be much higher, whereas processed food tends to be cheaper and cheaper calories coming from processed food. And that's been a big challenge for diet diversification and diet transformation in India. We've seen the growth in urban grocery chains, supermarket chains across India, and that growth has been very rapid. And that growth has been rapid because it's become a major means of providing food to urban populations. But the big challenge that we've had is that while the supermarket retail sector has been rising, the share of fresh food in this sector has been quite limited. So long shelf life food, processed food, etc., is much more easily available in the supermarket systems than fresh food. And part of the problem for that is that the connection of urban food value chains to smallholder systems in India has been very limited. The transactions cost for small farmers to connect into these systems has been very high. And by creating scale through aggregation of small farms, through cooperatives, through farmer producer organizations, etc., can reduce those transactions costs and can enhance the commercialization of small farm agriculture. And I think that's the motivation for aggregation that we should be looking at. And wherever there's opportunities for connecting into the urban supermarket value chains, or even just the urban food value chains, that's the growth opportunity for smallholder agriculture. And that's what we should be focusing on as we think about inclusive growth. Let's talk a little bit about India's own experience with aggregation. We've seen over the decades, there's been various attempts at aggregation of smallholder agriculture. The story of cooperatives and India's experience with cooperatives is historic. Its cooperatives have existed during colonial times and through independent India. More recently, there's been a push towards producer companies, farmer producer companies. And now there's a coexistence in many places of cooperatives and producer companies. I think it's useful to stop for a moment and say, what's the difference between the two? Cooperatives, coming under the Ministry of Cooperatives and the Cooperative Act, are essentially collective operations with members having one member, one vote, and a governance system that's very much a collective governance system. Cooperatives tend to work on a wide range of commodities, both food, non-food agriculture commodities, but even looking beyond that to textiles, etc. So it's a large set of activities that come under the cooperatives. Farmer producer companies, on the other hand, are much more structured as a commercial company. The governance system is much more structured as the governance systems for many of the corporations. There's a management structure, overall manager, etc. And also, profit maximization, profit motives are very central to producer companies. And members are shareholders in these companies. And unlike in cooperatives, the share of votes in the producer company depends on the share of the total land area or total assets that you bring into the company. So people with larger amounts of land tend to have a higher share of the votes in the company, etc. So that's essential difference that you see between the two. There's been quite a lot of experience in looking at farmer aggregation models in India. India has had one of the largest global experiences in the FPO movement, especially in the most recent time period. And that's something we'll talk about in this lecture today. So when we say FPOs, farmer producer organizations, one can think about FPOs covering a wide range of different activities. Some of the FPOs are cooperative societies, as we've talked about in terms of cooperatives, but they're also farmer producer companies, and they could also be private trustees, NGOs, etc. What I'd like to do is differentiate between farmer cooperatives and farmer producer companies in terms of the experience over the past few decades. As I mentioned earlier, cooperatives have been in existence for over 100 years and started from the British time onwards. And many of the early cooperatives were designed around very high value crops or very high value commodities, such as sugarcane, such as spices, etc. The companies, farmer producer companies, have been a more recent innovation. And over the past decade, the government has been promoting FPOs quite significantly. But we haven't tracked the numbers and the performance of FPOs adequately. So that's one thing that we've been doing at the Tata-Cornell Institute. So let's look at cooperatives. Cooperatives continue to be promoted, and we see that there's been a steady growth in cooperatives over time. But the big push in cooperatives came after 2015. And it's come with the 10,000 FPO scheme that the government of India has been promoting. As part of this 10,000 FPO scheme, we've seen an average of 6,000 additional cooperatives coming in to the country and being registered and operationalized. But there's big geographical differences. Some states tend to have much higher concentration of cooperatives, and that's presumably related to the agricultural systems in these states. You see Uttar Pradesh, Maharashtra, Karnataka, etc., having very high share of the total number of cooperatives within the country. Now, if you look at which types of cooperatives are functioning and continue to be active, I would say that there are two types of cooperatives that are functioning today. One type are cooperatives that are very focused on access to agricultural inputs, agriculture technology, agriculture information systems, market information, etc. So that's one type of cooperatives, and you find those to be in areas where there's significant market failure around access to inputs and access to information. On the other side, we see a significant share of the cooperatives are in products that tend to have high perishability, and that require going from the farm to the processing facilities in a very short period of time. So think about sugarcane. Once you cut the sugarcane, it has to get to the sugar mill in a very short period of time, otherwise it gets bad. Similarly, milk needs to get to the milk processing facility within a very short period of time. And that creates the incentives for farmers to create a cooperative and to be able to reduce that transactions costs of getting to the processing facility fast. But it also creates an incentive for the processing sector itself. It creates an incentives for the milk processing companies or the sugar mills, etc., to promote the cooperatives. Because by promoting these cooperatives, they are ensuring that there's an adequate supply that's steady, that's timely, etc. So the incentives are on both sides. And you find that these cooperatives of perishable products, highly specialized products, tend to have high asset fixity. What do I mean by asset fixity? There are specific technologies, there's specific knowledge associated with the production of these products. So, for example, a dairy farm cannot convert overnight into a rice farm. There are a very fixed set of assets that a dairy farm has that are very unique to being a dairy. And because of that, it also creates incentives for dairy farmers to come together in a cooperative and to create the scale around them. So that's the type of cooperatives we've seen. And not surprisingly, given the history of the dairy movement in India, dairy cooperatives have been some of the strongest cooperatives that are functioning today. And by strongest, I mean that not they've been established and there's large numbers of them, but that they continue to function over long periods of time. And I think that's an important distinction between cooperatives that have been registered and dormant versus cooperatives that continue to function over time. And again, not surprising, we find that some states, Gujarat, Maharashtra, Karnataka, etc., have the highest number of these dairy cooperatives. Now let's talk a little bit about the FPO movement. At the Tata-Cornell Institute, we put together a very strong database on FPOs in India. We've gone to the Ministry of Commerce, and identified all the registered FPOs in the country. And to give you a number, there are 44,500 or so FPOs that are currently registered in India. And in our database, which you can access by going to the Tata-Cornell website and look or Googling the Tata-Cornell FPO platform, you can see by state. You can click on any state in the country and you would know all the FPOs within the country. Even better, you can click on any district and you would get a list of FPOs in that district and FPOs by crop, etc. And you can see the management structure, who are the shareholders, who are the managers, etc. So it's a very powerful data set. And we are now working towards a way in which you can connect directly to individual FPOs. So as a trader, as a commercial operator, one can look at all the FPOs that are producing onions and say, yes, I want to connect with the onion producer in order to build into the onion value chain, etc. So that's an area that we've been quite interested in, and I welcome you to look at our website. So what do we know about farmer producer organizations in India? So the big number, as I mentioned, is about 44,500 registered FPOs in the country. But you will immediately say, yeah, but how many of them are operational? And I'll come to that. But the big growth in FPOs happened since 2020, after this big movement towards the 10,000 FPOs per year scheme that was promoted by the government. And 2020 onwards, we've seen about 35,000 new FPOs that have been registered. And there's been a particular emphasis on also registering or promoting female-led farmer producer companies. And so right now, we can see that there are about 6,500 exclusively female-led companies. And then there's a mix of male and female-led companies also. And the one state that has the highest number of farmer producer companies is Maharashtra. And I suspect Maharashtra is very unique in terms of very high levels of high value crop production and high value commodity production. And the incentives for creating these companies, farmer producer companies around those high value added commodities is very, very high. So now let's go to the question of, okay, how many of those 44,500 FPOs are functioning? So when we say functioning, what we've done is we've looked at the financial reporting that companies are required to make to the Ministry of Commerce every year as per the Companies Act. So companies that are viable and active report their financial status and are tax compliant. And so we've said, if you're reporting over the last 3 years, then you're a functioning company. But if you're not reporting, then you're a non-functioning company. So from the reporting point of view, we can say today that there are about 15,000 FPCs that are functioning and that are tax compliant. Of those 15,000, around 11,400 are functioning without any government support. So they've graduated beyond the government support and continue to be functioning as independent companies. So that's, I think, a very strong indicator of sustainability and self-sufficiency of these companies. Now, another strong indicator of the economic financial viability of these companies is their creditworthiness. So we've looked at how many of these companies have taken bank loans and are creditworthy from a banking and non-bank financial companies' point of view. And it turns out that of those 11,400 that are functioning, around 2,500 have been taking loans from the bank and have been very active in the financial market. So there are a set of companies, there are a set of farmer producer companies that are functioning and moving forward. But there's also a whole set that were registered through the drive, but never actually moved forward, never became functional. So the ones that are functional, what type of companies are they? So it's not surprising that dairy farms, dairy farmer producer companies are among the most functional. And this comes from the history of dairy cooperatives and the investments that have been made in the dairy sector Some of those cooperatives graduated to become companies, and you find that they're the ones you see as sustaining over the long term, becoming independent, becoming able to function even without any government support, etc. If you think about what types of crops the functioning FPOs and FPCs are producing, we find that obviously grains tend to have the highest number of FPCs. But if you look at the FPCs that are focused on grain, much of their commercial activity is on input access and technology access, much less on output marketing side. But then if you look at the fresh food sector, vegetables, cash crops, fruits, vegetable, livestock products, etc., almost all of them are producer companies that are very much focused on the output side. They're very much focused on connecting to the value chains, connecting to selling their product into an organized value chain, such as the milk value chain, the poultry value chain, vegetable value chains, etc. So this comes back to this idea that the reason why one would want to set up these FPCs is in order to be able to reduce the transactions costs associated with connecting into the markets, and also to give these companies bargaining power in being able to access the markets, get a better price advantage, better access to inputs, etc. So this big push towards FPCs happens since about 2020 onwards. And the push has been funded through two major agencies in India. SFAC has been one of the largest promoters. SFAC is under the Ministry of Agriculture. They've been a big promoter of FPCs. The other big promoter is NABARD. And so both SFAC and NABARD have been giving financial support for promoting FPCs. But then who actually does the on-the-ground promotion? Who actually sets them up and helps them become functional? Now, to our big surprise, the biggest players in setting up the FPCs on the ground are actually the larger food companies and the agribusiness companies. So we find that ITC and Bayer Crop Science and Patanjali Foods, etc., have been large-scale promoters on the ground of FPCs. When we first started this work, we thought it would be very much NGO-dominated. NGOs are important. Pradhan and other NGOs have played a big role in promoting FPCs. But the private sector, the food industry and agribusiness industry have taken a leading role in promoting FPCs. The other players that have been promoting FPCs are these consulting companies. Consulting companies such as Ernst & Young or Grant Thornton, etc., Price Waterhouse, have been also very active in promoting FPCs on the ground. What's the idea that private food companies and agribusiness companies are promoting FPCs shouldn't come as a big surprise to us, because that's the way in which you can build the value chain. So by promoting aggregation at the small farm level, companies such as ITC can then build the value chains up from the farm to the retail level. And so there's a great incentives for them to be helping in the promotion of FPCs on the ground. And that's something we learned as we looked at the data that's come out of it. We've also been looking at how do you assess the performance of FPCs? One way we talked about that was how long is an FPC active, right? But we're putting out a report that'll come out in a month or so on the state of FPOs in India, and it'll have some very detailed analysis on FPO performance, etc. Now, when we think about performance, we should be thinking about it in two levels. One is performance as a company. How does an FPC perform as an independent company? And the other is what benefits do members of the FPC get? So as a company, one of the best indicators obviously is whether it survives, how long it's surviving. But the other indicators are the profits that the FPC is generating, capacity utilization, etc. And when we look at this type of data, we find that the performance at a company level varies significantly by what's being produced. So we find that companies that produce high-value crops such as vegetables, fruit, etc., spices, etc., tend to be performing much better than companies that produce lower value crops. So you find very few farmer producing companies that produce rice or wheat having high performance compared to the ones that are growing vegetables or fruit, for example. The other set of companies that tend to have high performance are ones that are addressing a particular market failure, a market failure in access to inputs, access to technology, access to markets, etc. And that's where the FPO can provide some corrective action and can help the companies meet that demand from the value chains, etc. Then let's look at the benefits at the farm level. So where we've looked at a variety of studies that tried to assess individual farmer benefits from joining a farmer producer organization. And we've collected studies from across the world on this. And the paper published in Food Policy is available on our website. And here we looked at both the monetary benefits as well as the non-monetary benefits. So the left-hand side shows you the monetary benefits. For members that are joining an FPC relative to people who are not part of an FPC, there are significant gains in terms of income, better prices, access to market information, overall profits, cost reduction, technical efficiency, etc. And these have been documented across several hundreds of studies from around the world. On the other hand, on the non-market benefits, the non-monetary benefits, the big non-monetary benefits are access to market information and improved technical efficiency. But social capital, building social capital, organizational skills, management skills, collective action skills, etc., have been very important. And from a gender perspective, empowerment of women and building empowerment of women has been a major benefit that's come through these collective actions that have taken place. And on the issue of gender and women, it turns out that when we compare men led FPCs to women led FPCs or mixed FPCs, we find that the performance of women led FPCs tends to be significantly better than the performance of exclusively men led FPCs. And there's a question around that. And the question around that is that many of these women led FPCs had their roots in the self help group movement. And so they've gone from being women's self help groups, which have been promoted, as we all know, across the country quite significantly over the past few decades. They've graduated from being self help groups to becoming cooperatives or farmer producer organizations. Now, one of the questions that I would have that we've not really answered, but it's something that we should be asking is 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 the performance better for women-led FPCs because of gender, because it's a women-led group, or because of the support that they have been receiving by their promoters? So many of the self-help groups have actually been promoted through NGOs, through civil society organizations. And there's been significant handholding of these groups by the NGO community over a long period of time. And even their graduation from being self-help group to cooperatives or farmer produce organizations was promoted through the NGO groups. So the question that comes up is the better performance related to the gender or related to the extent to which they continue to have significant handholding by the NGO community? And if the NGO community withdraws from supporting a particular women-led FPC, would they continue to function at a high level? I think that's a question that needs to be looked at and figure out. It's kind of difficult to figure this out because the history around independent, self-reliant FPCs is still quite new. And so the numbers that have graduated to become fully independent is still very small. But that's something I think one needs to look at into the future. So, can this push towards promotion of FPOs succeed? We've seen a history of attempts at farmer aggregation models, and many of them haven't succeeded. Even today, the share of FPOs that are functioning relative to those that have been registered is still quite small. And so, what's the future? Do we expect success rates to improve over time or not? Well, one can only hypothesize, but I suspect that the conditions for creating scale are much better today than they were even a decade ago. Urban market demands are increasing for food diversity and better quality food, safer food, etc. Urban food value chains are now expanding significantly into rural areas. And there's a demand for bringing food from rural communities into urban markets. And so there's a demand from urban food suppliers to create scale at the farm level in order for them to be able to access adequate quantities, quality food, and to do it in a timely manner. So there's a demand coming in for creating these systems. And at the farm level, small farms, in order to be able to participate in the growth process, would also have an incentive to create that aggregation. We see that there's been significant promotion and policy support that's coming in, and it's coming in through the government, etc. Government policy in India has been very, very strong on promoting these aggregation models. But also the private sector interest is very high, and donor interest is very high. And the private sector interest, especially the food value chain sector, could be a big driver of the change that will happen. So as the overall economy grows, as the overall demand for food diversity increases, and the demand for high value products increases, one can see that that demand can drive change at the rural level and promote further growth in the FPO market. So let me finish with one final thought. There seems to be a debate going on today in India on whether we should be promoting FBCs as companies or whether we should be promoting cooperatives in the traditional cooperative manner. My response is it's not an either or issue. One can see a role of cooperatives in areas where one needs to build collective empowerment. One needs to build collective social capital. One needs to build an ability for poor rural communities to be able to enhance their productivity, access to technologies, etc. On the other hand, there's a role for for farmer producer companies in areas where there's potential for growing high value commodities and for connecting into markets. So there's a place for both approaches. With the diversity of conditions in the country, with the diversity of food systems in the country, one can look at a diversity of options for aggregation that work best in each of these specific conditions. And there's no one size fits all here. But I suspect as we look ahead, aggregation will continue to be an area that will be important. And it's an area that we should be continuing to study as academics and as policymakers. Let me end by showing you our website again and invite you to look at our website on farmer producer organizations. And you can even connect to individual farmer producer organizations through our My Connect, My FPO site also. So once again, thank you very much for inviting me to give the Professor Radhakrishna Memorial Lecture. And I'm sorry I could not be there in person, and I wish you all the best for the rest of this conference. Thank you very much.